All right, so we've gone over what LOGMODE table do I use. I always use the LOGMODE table associated with the secondary LU, and if he doesn't have a mode tab, I always use the IBM default LOGMODE table, ISTI and CLM. We've talked about talked about where we have to resolve the class of service. The class of service in the subarea network has to be resolved at the secondary LU side of the subarea network. The class of services always reside at the originating LU side of the APPN network, whether the originating LU is the PLU or the SLU. So now we're going to go through some fairly complicated, long-winded examples of how we would do a SLU init and a PLU init across multiple networks, multiple subarea and APPN networks. Very, very long-winded, so please be aware that this might take my breath away a little bit. Might take yours away a little bit also when you see what happens. I'm going to start out with a secondary LU initiated session, which seems a little bit strange. It seems a little strange because when the LU62 architecture in APPN was first invented, all they supported was PLU init. So it's strange that once we merge these two architectures together, that SLU init is the one that actually works best. But the reason SLU init works best is because when the SLU is the OLU, remember where we picked the class of service in subarea on the SLU side. Remember where we picked the class of service in APPN, it's on the OLU side. When the OLU is the SLU, both the subarea and the APPN networks are picking the class of service at the same side of the network. And that's basically what makes these two work well together. So let's talk about how a SLU init would work. Secondary LU tries to log on. Maybe we provide a LOGMODE name, maybe we don't. If we don't provide a LOGMODE name, we're in the secondary LU's host, so we can pick the default LOGMODE name. We either pick it from the first entry in the SLU's table, or we pick it from the first entry inside the default table. Once we've got the LOGMODE name resolved, now we're about to send our search request into the subarea network, into the APPN network. And we realize before I do that, I'm on the OLU side of an APPN network, I need to have an APPN class of service. So it's not clear whether I'm going to use the LOGMODE table method to pick the APPN class of service, or whether I'm going to use the class of service mapping table method, the subarea to APPN and APPN to subarea cost mapping table method. So what happens in this host actually is we can't use the class of service mapping table method unless we have one of the class of services already. So we have to use the mode tab method to pick either the subarea cost name or the APPN cost name first, and then we can use the APPN to subarea or subarea to APPN cost mapping tables to map it to the other. So we looked at which one should we look at first. Should we look up the APPN one? Should we look up the subarea one? Should we look up the one that we need the most? It turns out it was both of them caused problems, and so we wound up coding it the way that it was easiest. And the way that it was easiest to code was we look up the subarea cost name first. So here's really the way it works. I look the LOGMODE name up inside the SLU's LOGMODE table, and I find a LOGMODE entry. I take the subarea class of service name out, and I put it in my subarea class of service field. I take the APPN class of service name out, and I put it in my back pocket. Then I look the subarea cost name up in a subarea to APPN cost mapping table. If there is no table, the one in my back pocket gets used. If there's a table but there's no match for the subarea cost name that I picked, I take the one in my back pocket. If I find a matching entry and it maps to a valid APPN class of service name, I use that APPN class of service name and I throw the one in my pocket away. Now in this case, I'm also the SSAP of the SLU, so I keep the subarea cost name around as my subarea cost through this little subarea network right here, and I use the APPN cost to send my locate request out. And because the mode name has already been resolved, I can send the mode name and the APPN cost name out on the request. When it reaches this interchange node right here, we have an APPN class of service name coming in on the request, and because we're at the secondary LU side of the subarea network, it's our job to pick the class of service for the subarea network. Because I already have an APPN class of service, I look up in this interchange node whether I have an APPN to subarea class of service mapping table. And if I do, I will map my APPN subarea class of service back to a matching subarea class of service. And in that case, everything works great because you never really had to look up a LOGMODE table for the secondary LU in that host. Remember, in this host, the secondary LU is probably represented by a cross-domain resource. And it could be a dynamically created cross-domain resource, which means it may not have a mode tab associated with it. So the fact that I have to do an APPN to subarea cost mapping table here means that it works very well. Unfortunately, because APPN to subarea and subarea to APPN cost mapping tables don't always work well, I'm not sure I recommend you doing that. And if you don't do that, now you have to worry about this guy picking a subarea class of service, not using the class of service mapping table method, and instead using the LOGMODE table method. If this is a dynamic CDRC, and it does not have a mode tab on it, and it does not have a DLOGMODE on it, it's possible that we don't get a mode name incoming. Actually, we would have a LOGMODE name always coming in this direction. If we look up the LOGMODE name inside his LOGMODE table and we don't find it, we're probably going to end up using the IST-COS-DF entry instead. The default value for IST-COS-DF entry is to go ahead and use it for any independent LUs, which basically from VTAM's perspective means cross-domain resources. And in this host, the SLU is a cross-domain resource. So when the request makes it to here, if we are using the LOGMODE table method here, we hardly ever find the SLU's LOGMODE table inside the SLU's table because it doesn't have a mode table. So instead we look it up inside the IBM default table, IST-INCLN, and we don't find it there either because they're your LOGMODE names, they're not IBM's, right? And so instead what we wind up using is the first entry inside the IST-INCLN LOGMODE table. And the first entry happens to be the interact entry. So if you start SLU init sessions and everything is using #enter, that's probably the reason why. It's because you've got an interchange node here who's got to pick subarea APPN class of service names, and he's doing it based on no information at all about the SLU, and so he winds up using a lot of defaults which resolve down to the #enter. All right, let's suppose we've got a valid subarea class of service name. We send this subarea request, the session request through the subarea network as a CDNet request, and it's got the mode name and the subarea class of service name on it. We hit the second interchange node now here, and as the entry point into this APPN network, it's our job to pick an APPN class of service. So here we are again. We've got a subarea class of service. We need an APPN class of service. If I have a subarea to APPN-COS mapping table in this node, I will go ahead and use it, and I'll map it to an APPN class of service. If I don't have a subarea APPN class of service mapping table, then this node essentially has to do the same thing that this node does. We have to pick an entry from the SLU's LOGMODE table. We have to look the LOGMODE name up in the SLU's LOGMODE table. But the SLU is probably represented here by a dynamic CDRC, no mode tab on it, no DLOGMODE on it, nothing like that. So instead I wind up picking the first entry inside ISTLM, and I get #connect for the APPN set portion of my session path. When it gets over to this node, effectively the same thing happens that happened over here. We can try to use the APPN to subarea cost mapping table method to pick the subarea cost name here, or we can try to use the LOGMODE table method. Either one of them would work. The same problems, the same issues work. So in this case here, the LOGMODE table method causes you some problems. But the subarea APPN and APPN to subarea cost mapping table method actually seems to alleviate some of those problems if it worked all the time. The problem is it doesn't work all the time. And you'll see that when we go through the PLU-initiated flavor. So that's what we're going to take up next. This is a PLU-initiated session going through the same thing.